So welcome to the last fourth panel titled Reconsidering South Asia's International Relations Through History. So one idea behind ESSAIR was to bring together different disciplines to discuss South Asia, and that's a little bit the aim of this panel, which reflects the importance of history and historical perspectives to understand South Asia, but also the interesting dialogue which has increased between IR and history in the field of South Asian studies. So here are three great papers which all offer very deep archival research and which showcase the different new directions in which research is currently going. So two papers, the one by Ameya, Pratap, Singh, and Deepal, shows how history helps us reconsider common narratives underpinning, shows the engagement between IR and history. And Tanja Buehler's paper shows how history helps us reconsider different common narratives about the transitions between different periods, the worlds of empires to the one of states, from pre-modern politics to modern politics. Start with Tanja Buehler's paper entitled The Transition from Intercultural Diplomacy to an Exclusive European International Law and Indirect Rule, European and Asian Intermediaries at the Court of Hyderabad, 1770-1815. So Tanja completed an award-winning PhD thesis on colonial security policy in German East Africa, 1885-1918 at the University of Bern. She was visiting professor for European and Global History at the University of Rostock, docent for migration history at the University of Bern, and until April 2020, visiting professor for military history, cultures of violence at the University of Potsdam. She is currently publishing her second book-length manuscript titled Intercultural Diplomacy and Empire in the Age of Revolutions, European and Asian Intermediaries at the Court of Hyderabad, 1770-1815. She has also published Cooperation and Empire, Local Impacts on Global Processes in 2017. We'll then follow with a paper by Ameya Pratap Singh entitled From the Edge of the Precipice, Fear, Historical Learning and Security Dilemma, Sensibility in Nehru's Foreign Policy. Ameya is reading for a DPhil in Area Studies at the University of Oxford. He has previously completed his MPhil in South Asian Studies from the University of Cambridge and Masters in IR from the LSE. And his research at Oxford analyzes how we can understand and theorize India's trust-building efforts with regional security competitors such as Pakistan and China in the 50s. And last but not least, we'll have a paper by Deepal entitled Mediated Images, Tibet and the Influence of China on India's Foreign Policy, 1950-1959. And Deepal is a non-resident fellow at the National Bureau of Asian Research. He advises and contributes to NBR research programs on political and security issues in Asia. He's also pursuing his doctoral studies at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. Prior to this, Deepal was involved with the Political and Security Affairs Group at NBR, and he has also worked at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. And we are delighted to have with us as discussant Dr. Bérénice Guyot-Réchard, who is a senior lecturer in 20th century international history at King's College London. And Bérénice's work focuses on the impact of decolonization in South Asia, particularly in terms of international politics. She's particularly interested in the connections between states, nation building, and geopolitics, notably in border spaces like the Himalaya and the Indian Ocean. And her most recent book, as probably everyone knows, has been published in 2016 by CUP and is entitled Shadow States, India, China, and the Himalayas. So a very distinguished panel of speakers. Thank you very much for being here. And I leave the floor to Tanja for the first presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, hello everybody. Greetings from Switzerland. My presentation is about the transition from intercultural diplomacy in early modern South Asia to an exclusive international law. International history regarding relations between Europe and the global South has established a narrative of a global shift from foreign relations on equal terms in early modern times to an exclusive international law at the end of the 19th century. The moment of a global turn to an exclusive international order is commonly perceived in the Berlin Africa Conference of 1884-85. The European powers assembled solely recognized modern nation states as sovereigns, which implied the exclusion of non-Western polities from international law and in practice reduced them to the role of colonized subjects. My argument is that this moment of a profound transformation in foreign relations between Europe and the global South already took place in 18th century interstate relations in South Asia. Let me begin with the political setting and the diplomatic agents. The disintegrating Mughal Empire during the 18th century was interconnected with dynamic regional Indian state building processes. However, most Indian states did not develop into a full-fledged bureaucratic central state with clear-cut borders, but were shaped by patron-client networks between local and regional authorities. The East India Company was characterized by its dual nature as a private body of enterprise and public authority with state minds like Rose through exclusive sovereign rights granted by the Crown. The fact that British diplomats acted on behalf of the company earned them the stereotype of undignified merchants. But the lack of a high rank of a king's representative and of a known ceremonial tradition enabled them to adapt and to fit into local forms of diplomatic and symbolic interaction. Most importantly, the compatibility of these different political systems was created through European and Asian diplomatic intermediaries in everyday face-to-face encounters. Specialized European and Asian groups of cross-cultural diplomacies emerged who shared a high geographical and cultural mobility and a common sociability. They likewise had to maintain trust from the foreign powers they negotiated with, and they thus formed the glue of mutual trust in cross-cultural foreign relations without institutionalized guarantees. Asian and British diplomatic intermediaries thus basically found themselves in an interpersonal professional network of cross-cultural double or multiple patronage. However, through anti-corruption reforms implemented in the 1790s, company servants' loyalties became increasingly aligned with British imperial authority and abstract national identifiers. Servants of the company who returned to Britain with a spectacular fortune became increasingly accused of corruption. As a consequence, company servants were no longer allowed to accept gifts from Indian rulers or to pursue private trade. Also, their inter-ethnic relations and social entanglements with noble Indian families became increasingly attacked. This anti-corruption policy was not primarily motivated by metropolitan professional standards. Domestic governance at the time, likewise, was strongly shaped by clientelism and corruption of an elite circle. Nor were these anti-corruption reforms motivated by racism, but rather by the fact that cross-cultural, social, and familial entanglements were implying political and material obligations for Indian communities. This nationalization and racialization of the company's public service were supposed to harness imperial wealth for British national interests. Since the company at the same time maintained an aggressive policy of patronage and bribery towards Indian diplomatic agents, the cross-cultural network of patronage relations became increasingly lopsided, laying the foundation of larger asymmetries in power. Nevertheless, interactions in court ceremonials and symbolic exchanges remain shaped by local Indo-Persian customs. By contrast, on the level of more abstract and legal interstate agreements, European-style treaties in the sense of contractual mutual agreements emerged as a key diplomatic practice within the broader frame of alliance building. The introduction of treaty making in South Asia, however, did not mark the beginning of the extinguishment of Indian rulers' sovereignty. On the one hand, initially a transcultural patchwork of layered Mughal and European legal regulations was produced on the ground. On the other hand, treaty making was appropriated by Indian rulers as a useful method to advance their interest, particularly to enhance their sovereignty claims and also to stabilize the fluid and strongly contested vassal-suzerain relations in South Asia. This is corroborated by various complaints Indian authorities advanced by reaching out to the British Crown during the 1780s. They claimed that the company was not abiding by treaty and thus violated its own legal tradition. Indian rulers were not only looking for justice, but also sought to finalize treaties with the Crown and to extend their diplomatic network to Europe. This not only implied a deep trust in company governance, but also a challenge of the Mughal emperor as the highest source of legitimacy in South Asia. At first glance, Indian rulers' diplomatic initiatives appear to have been successful. Metropolitan authorities ordered the company to recognize Indian rulers as sovereigns, strictly abide by treaties, and maintain Western legal standards in order to maintain Indian rulers' cooperation. Some British observers who criticized the company's arbitrariness even refer to the law of nations as the guiding legal norm. However, such a rhetoric of an inclusive law of nations should not be taken at face value. British national authorities and the Crown ultimately refused to become directly involved in negotiations and agreements with Indian rulers, which implied that Indian rulers were not really recognized as equals of European sovereigns and were excluded from the European diplomatic system and family of nations. The metropolitan transfer of these legal regulations to the fringes of empire primarily served to harness national constitutional authority over the company. The governorship of Cornwallis followed these metropolitan legal guidelines, and treaty making established as a common rule of engagement in cross-cultural alliances in South Asia during the 1790s. Scholars of British imperial history claim that Cornwallis acted like a conventional diplomat in an 18th century European context and applied these norms of the Westphalian state system and international law to British foreign relations with South Asian states. But as mentioned before, this policy was largely a response to Indian rulers' complaints. In addition, Cornwallis himself never referred to such ideas as a point of reference. Certain concepts, such as the balance of powers, just happened to have been shared in a specific historical constellation by the different parties involved in cross-cultural exchange. Such cross-cultural adoptions and appropriations should not be mistaken as harmonious mutual adaptations. When, in the context of the French wars, gave the Governor General Wellesley the metropolitan consent to implement a system of subsidiary alliances with Indian rulers, Wellesley dictated the new stipulations that extinguished Indian states' external sovereignty. This fierce wind of change in the British South Asian diplomatic culture implied that treaties lost their core European legal characteristics of voluntary and reciprocal agreements between equals and reduced Indian states to the status of a protectorate. This marked the establishment of a new form of politis legal status that neither converged with early modern European nor with local conceptions of protection. Whereas in the European context of modern nation-building processes and the rationalization of international relations during the 19th century abolished the concept of protection as a legitimate political concept, in the context of European expansion, protection would become a useful legal instrument of colonial rule in the global South. To conclude, I come back to my starting point of the narrative of a global shift from an inclusive to an exclusive legal regulation of foreign relations outside Europe. Interstate relations in South Asia have never been completely inclusive because the British sovereign at no point became directly involved in treaty making. However, there was a shift around 1800 to a radical legal exclusion or a double legal exclusion when the company established the new political status of protectorates, which commonly are related to the age of high imperialism with the beginning of the scramble of Africa. So the Berlin Africa Conference only codified existing realities of asymmetric power relations with the Global South in international law. As a final point, I want to refer to 19th century British narratives on foreign relations between the company and Indian states. These narratives are soaked with the rhetoric of the presumably lawless Asiatic despot who did not perceive or recognize the core characteristic of treaty making. These narratives also claim that Cornwallis' approach of a balance of power and cross-cultural interstate regulations through treaties on equal terms failed to realize the extent of the difference between the East and the West. Therefore, they continue the policy to transfer European international legal regulations to South Asia was doomed, and the only alternative left was Wellesley's implementation of the Pax Britannica. Yet studying the various transcultural forms of transactions negotiated by British and Asian intermediaries, and the fact that many Indian rulers adopted the legal instrument of treaty making and European interstate legal regulations proved that a sharp difference between the East and the West in diplomatic practices on the ground did never exist. The British Orientalist argumentation thus served as an apologetic justification of British Indian politics that favored imperial rule over diplomacy and legal regulated foreign and interstate relations on equal terms. I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tanja. You're right on time. That's perfect. Thank you very much for the paper. So we can proceed. We can proceed with Ameya's paper.
In opposition to much of the previous scholarship on India-Pakistan relations that focuses on conflict, the empirical puzzle that my paper concerns itself with is how is cooperation made possible and trust built between the two rivals. To be more specific, how did local actor theorizations, ideas, and historical learnings, perhaps unique to the post-colonial South Asian context, shape India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru's trust-building efforts with respect to Pakistan? To answer this question, I examine Nehru's reflexive understanding of the role of fear in world politics, or his security dilemma sensibility. Moving forward, I will refer to this as SDS, since it's quite a mouthful. As is popularly known, during India's freedom struggle, Nehru was the preeminent spokesperson for the Indian National Congress on Foreign Affairs, and later also helmed the Ministry of External Affairs during his 17-year term as Prime Minister. I argue that Nehru's writings, speeches, and policy decisions uncover useful and critical insights into the politics of fear that dominated most of the 20th century. Nehru was an early decrier of political realism, and his critique was rooted in the intellectual history of the Indian anti-colonial struggle and its challenges to the imperialisms of Western modernity. Additionally, his third world sensibilities, as opposed to most realists writing in the wake of catastrophic wars, was shaped by the triumph and hope of securing nationhood for the Indian peoples. He was therefore, as historian Sunil Purushottam has argued, a self-conscious agent of historical change who shared a humanistic conviction in agency and learning driving progress. I will organize my presentation in two parts. First, I discuss Nehru's SDS as a site of deductive historical learning, acquired as a critique of power politics. Here I draw on Nicholas Wheeler and Ken Booth's theoretical account of SDS and show how counter-hegemony shaped Nehru's understanding of fear. In the second section, I briefly demonstrate SDS's effects on Nehru's decision-making during the refugee crisis with Pakistan on the Bengal border in 1950. In particular, I highlight its contributions to trust building between India and Pakistan, evidenced by the signing of the Nehru-Liaquat Agreement. Wheeler and Booth define SDS as an actor's intention and capacity to perceive the motives behind and to show responsiveness towards the potential complexity of the military intentions of others. In particular, SDS refers to an actor's ability to understand the role that fear might play in their adversaries' attitudes and behavior, including crucially the role that their own actions may have played in provoking that fear. Building on the pioneering texts of John Hers and Herbert Butterfield, the two scholars understand the challenge posed by the security dilemma as decision-making amidst the existential condition of unresolvable uncertainty, mainly due to the inability of actors to access private information or the motives or intentions of other actors. Yet, as opposed to fatalistic realist theorizing, they argue that negative outcomes are not essential to the definition of a security dilemma, and positive outcomes are available in principle and sometimes in practice, implying that states under certain circumstances can in fact transcend what Robert Jervis describes as the spiral of mutual fear and hostility. To do so, however, actors require SDS, or the ability to empathize and appreciate the fearful motivations of their security competitors. This is a crucial first step and a reflexive pivot that allows for a reconfiguration of bilateral ties and the relational structures within which they are embedded. For instance, Janice Gross-Stein has argued that being an uncommitted thinker, or in other words, having SDS, helped Mikhail Gorbachev realize that Soviet Russia could no longer pursue its objectives through conflict or coercion, and encouraged him to pursue conciliatory signaling in an effort to share these reformed intentions with the United States. In his later work, Wheeler has asserted that while SDS was not sufficient, its de-ideologizing presence was a necessary precondition for trust building through face-to-face diplomacy. For instance, between Vajpayee and Sharif during the signing of the Lahore Declaration. In Nehru's case, as opposed to previous scholarship on experiential learning and crisis shocks, it was deductive historical learning that played a prominent role in engendering SDS. In his reading of world history, leading up to World War I, despite a reluctance in Germany, Russia, England, and France at the time, it was an overruling sense of fear that had precipitated war. The major European powers, and I quote, each feared and hated and envied the other, and this fear and hatred produced a feverish competition between these engines of destruction, end quote. Based on these historical learnings, as the Cold War emerged, Nehru predicted that the sense of fear which was pervading great countries was once again likely to be followed by what he referred to as evil consequences. And I quote, now the Americans appeared to be obsessed by fear and suffering from high nervous tension, due to a strange combination of pride in their strength and apprehensiveness about the future as represented by Russia and communism. On the other hand, the Russians from long experience suspected everybody, end quote. I argue that roughly 3 strands of thinking emerge from an analysis of fear in Nehru's political thought. First is that fear is relational and socially constructed through coercive discourses and realist practices. Second, that fear spirals are characterized by an increasing risk of preemptive war. And third, that fear is endemic to empire and imperial great power hierarchies. I will elaborate on this third point further. What undergirds Nehru's broader understanding of fear is counter-hegemony, or the critical appreciation of the relationship between what he referred to as the old policy of expansion and empire and the balance of power, which inevitably led to conflict and war. Nehru saw empire and global capitalism as legitimizing territorial expansionism and imperial exploitation, rendering colonies as playthings of great powers and paving the way for war over dominion. Here, I argue that Nehru's subordinate positionality provides a unique and possibly fuller exposition of the workings of fear hierarchies. The relative inattention to fear's ordering effects and its acceptance as a natural condition within Western realist IR has been in large part due to its justifications being written from the vantage points or on the basis of the histories of great powers. As Nehru once asked, what are the underlying causes of war in the modern world? Well, one of the basic causes was the domination of one country by another, or an attempt to dominate. This was because the whole structure of industrial capitalism and its offshoot imperialism was based on conflict and competition and exploitation. Thus, in the East, nationalism, child of imperialism, became its bitter enemy. Nehru argued that fear and systemic exploitation could not be challenged until great powers yielded imperialist and acquisitive tendencies and laid the foundations of a new political order on the peaceful cooperation of free nations. I argue that these insights and historical inferences did meaningfully guide Nehru's decision-making. In particular, since he believed that fear was socially constructed and not an immutable fact of anarchy, it became possible for him to imagine an alternative paradigm for political engagement between adversaries or security competitors. Coming to the case study, the Nehru Liaquat Agreement, or Minorities Pact, was signed by Nehru and his Pakistani counterpart Liaquat Ali Khan on April the 8th, 1950. It was widely heralded as a path-breaking instance of conciliation between India and Pakistan that had successfully deterred a major catastrophe. Origins of the refugee crisis have been traced back to December 1949, when a supposed police crackdown on communist troublemakers in a village in the Khulna district of East Bengal, which had a predominantly Hindu population, began a large-scale movement of Hindu and in response Muslim refugees across the Bengal border. The uncontrollable stream of refugees threatened to destabilize India and Pakistan's effective sovereign control by reproducing the state of lawlessness and emergency prevailing in the aftermath of partition. The respective rehabilitation capacities of both states had already been exhausted due to the previous exodus on the Punjab border. The imminent danger of state failure then, compounded by the fears of a burgeoning regional rivalry, had produced a volatile amalgam of misperception and escalation, all features enticing a preemptive military recourse. At the height of the crisis, Nehru wrote to British Prime Minister Clement Attlee that the treatment of minorities had now taken precedence over the settlement of the Kashmir issue for the maintenance of peace between India and Pakistan. I argue, therefore, that the underlying factors that facilitated trust building between Indian and Pakistani elites warrants examination. During the refugee crisis, the crucial influence on Nehru's decision-making was SDS, which became operative as the crisis escalated and the fear spiral became apparent. After partition, while Nehru did respond to fears of Pakistan's aggression, he also began to reflexively appreciate its consequences. On April 1st, in a personal letter to his sister and Indian diplomat, Vijayalakshmi Pandit, he inquired, why are people so full of hatred for each other? We have had a vivid example of this in India, that is between Pakistan and India. It is the same or worse between Russia and America now. Hatred and cruelty, I think, ultimately come from fear. Here, quite clearly, Nehru recognizes the role played by relational fear in intensifying the rivalry between India and Pakistan, likening it to early Cold War tensions between the US and Soviet Russia. Later, commenting on India's role in this respect, Nehru acknowledged that his Pakistan policy had not been very wise, and the public mind in India had certainly encouraged intransigence in Pakistan. He also strongly advocated for restraint in political discourse, stating, and I quote, "The old traditions of diplomacy have been forgotten. Today, the new tradition is to carry on this verbal warfare in the strongest language in public. But that leads to fighting or may lead to fighting," end quote. As becomes apparent in Nehru's private correspondence and parliamentary speeches prior to the signing of the Nehru-Liaquat Agreement, in terms of encouraging a preference for a diplomatic resolution and trust building, SDS and historical learning had three key implications. First, it enjoined him to transcend the security dilemma through practices of hedging and restrained discourse that reconciled the divergence between ends and means. Second, SDS generated a greater appreciation of war as an inefficient outcome due to higher risk aversion and receptivity to material costs. Third, and most importantly, it created space for Nehru to trust Liaquat, even in the presence of strong countervailing negative emotions. This was despite the lack of headway made by either party during the preceding crisis bargaining period, and despite the overall adversarial nature of bilateral relations. For instance, on April 4th, when Nehru apprised B.C. Roy, the West Bengal chief minister, on the progress of talks, he stated the earnest desire of Liaquat to come to some agreement. When the Indian press confronted Nehru with Pakistan's previously lacking record of compliance with bilateral agreements, Nehru responded that a number of agreements had been acted upon, and even those that were not fully acted upon were partly acted upon. He proceeded to remind the Indian press that Liaquat was an old resident of Uttar Pradesh and was known to Indian leaders in a personal capacity. Therefore, their talks were very frank, and there was no attempt made to avoid any difficult issue. India even watered down its demand for a strong bilateral mechanism to enforce the terms of the agreement. This was done to meet Liaquat's apprehension that domestic audiences in Pakistan would worryingly perceive any joint commission as a step towards the future reunification of East and West Bengal. Instead, the agreement provided a bureaucratic infrastructure for day-to-day regulation. However, in the absence of any cross-state monitoring, its realization still rested equally on the goodwill, cooperation, and commitment of both parties. Through the Nehru-Liaquat Agreement, erstwhile adversaries had become accountable to each other on the issue of the protection of minority rights. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, and also you're right on time. I didn't need to show you a 5-minute paper. So we'll now proceed with Deepal's paper. Thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful. Don't worry, this is not the wrong presentation. It's actually the right one. And the reason why I decided to start with this is because I couldn't figure out if I should start with a good evening or a good afternoon, and this just seemed very representative of this of how this conference has brought together people from across the world from various time zones. I quickly want to also thank the organizers, Chris, Nico, Raphaëlle, and the others who have actually managed to pull this off. This is the first full-fledged 2-day IR conference I've been on online. And at a time when many other conferences have gotten cancelled and deferred, I think it's remarkable that this is actually going ahead, albeit online. And I only hope that in the next iteration we actually manage to all of us meet in one geography, and we don't have to do it from across the world. Having said that, I'm going to move on to my presentation. I'm just going to also quickly start a stopwatch so that I have an idea of how I'm doing on time. Okay, so my presentation, my paper is about mediated images, Tibet and the influence of China on India's foreign policy. And essentially, I would be looking at established frameworks of IR and how they work on Indian foreign policy, with the help of something that I call mediated self-images, and I will get to what I mean by that in just a minute. In this particular case, I talk about India's self-image vis-a-vis China and how that has influenced Indian foreign policy. And in terms of an agent of mediation for the purpose of this presentation is Tibet. And I use a modified version of an images framework to examine how India's policy towards Tibet changed from 1950 to 1959 and how that influenced India's policy towards China. So I look at two particular cases. One is the approach towards Tibet in 1950 and the other towards Tibet in 1959. And as we know, these are the this time period essentially bookends the two most important events in modern Tibet's history, right? In 1950, we know that the PLA attacks Tibet with the expectation of being able to make it a part of the newly formed PRC. And around that time, for almost a year, between the end of 1950 until about the middle of 1951, there is this concern that the Dalai Lama might want to come to India. And in fact, the Dalai Lama's people even inform the Indian office in Lhasa. And Delhi responds to this largely by saying that, sure, the Dalai Lama is definitely welcome, but let's make sure that that is a decision that the Tibetans themselves take. So there is this agreement, but also some kind of a reluctance. You don't see any kind of proactive behavior on India's part. In fact, at some point there is a letter that goes from Delhi to Lhasa, which says that we need to impress upon the Dalai Lama that if he leaves Tibet, it will psychologically affect the Tibetan people, and it will be bad for the fight that Tibetans are putting up to stay independent. On the other hand, in 1959, what we see is that even before the Dalai Lama has decided to leave Tibet, or maybe has decided, but even before his office has spoken to the Indian representatives in Lhasa, Delhi, on the other hand, has decided that if the Dalai Lama chooses to come to India, he would be given asylum. So if you look at the quote, the second quote, it was sent from Delhi on 15th of March, 1959. The Dalai Lama, as we know, left Lhasa on the 17th of March, 1959. So even, and only after he had left was when his people came to the Indian consulate there and talked about how he had left and he intended to take asylum in India. But by that time, India had already decided and sent across this instruction to Lhasa. So the question essentially, which this brings us to, is specifically how and why did India decide not to act in the case of Tibet in 1950 when China attacked, but decided to provide asylum to the Dalai Lama proactively, in fact, in 1959. And I use the specificity of this question to look at a larger question, to look at basically the overall motivations of decision-making, foreign policy decision-making. And obviously, this is a question that can be approached in various ways. The way that I want to use today is by looking at cognitive factors that influence decision-making. Of course, we have seen more traditional IR approaches to Indian foreign policy decision-making, which thankfully has changed in recent years. We have seen a lot of new scholarship that has used a lot of new material to look at various newer ways of looking at the entire question of Indian foreign policy decision making. But today, and I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answers if anyone is interested. But for now, let's jump into how I propose to do this. So the framework that I use comes from Robert Jervis's Logic of Images. He uses the cognitive approach. And he basically, his starting point is by asking what role does the way that decision makers perceive the world influence their decision making. And he suggests that in case of two states, all actors, they operate under different realities, which essentially is how they perceive their worlds. It's a basic constructivist understanding, right? You have an idea of how your world is constructed, and that influences how you look at the world and everything in it. So the aspects of things like biases or heuristics or stereotypes and all of them, they become important in this case. Now, he also says that states project images of how they want to be seen, as well as they interpret how these images are being received by other states. And these images are essentially carriers of values. What kind of values? Like the examples he gives are goodwill or saving face or prestige. And they, he claims, guide what the state considers are foreign policy goals. So I take this particular framework and I add some of my own modifications. So if you look at what Jervis says, it essentially is a very straightforward relationship between state A and state B. What I am trying to suggest here is that this is not always such a straightforward bilateral relationship, but at times you need a mediation of other states like state C, D, and E. So in the Indian context, this means that how two relatively comparable powers, state A, state B, India and China, interact with one another requires one to understand how third smaller actors in the region are involved. So Tibet, for example, comes in the lower part of this inverted triangle. This also means two things. One is that India's foreign policy choices, at least in the region, are powerfully shaped by self-image, as well as a very strong desire that others respect the self-image. And in India's immediate neighborhood, it is perceptions of China that fundamentally structure how India relates to the small regional actors. So next, I go on to something that that is called the aspect of images. Now, while there are obviously many other aspects of images that are dynamic and vibrant, the ones that I inductively derive are these three. So civilizational conviction, which essentially suggests that India believes that it deserves it rises from India's imagination to be, as a bigger player that it was before 1947 over centuries, and that is something that it hopes to rightfully regain at some point in time. It believes itself to be a power that where it had its own sphere of influence, and it again will get there because it deserves to be. And in fact, we see Nehru and others talk about this, or Nehru in fact writes about this in Discovery of India as well. The other one is territorial anxiety, which largely or most strongly rises from India's experiences during partition. And it essentially says that India believes that the territory that it imagines to be India is unquestionable. What it claims to be its territory is its own, and there can be no contestation of that. There are also versions where, as Stephen Hoffman points out, there is also this imagination that India's territoriality has been handed down to it by through the years, through generations of its time. For example, how the Himalayas are where India's territory extends up to. And the third one is essentially the idea of development as a component of foreign policy. This may come in the form of direct development assistance or technical know-how, knowledge sharing, or even trade that will help the region develop. And this emanates from the belief that only with the development of others can India itself develop. So for India to develop in the region, there has to, for India to reach its potential, there has to be others in a peaceful region who are doing well for themselves. So with the help of these three particular aspects of images, I will now look at the specifics of how they changed between 1950 and 1959. Now, before I go on, a quick word about these cartoons. This particular one is from a Bengali newspaper by a cartoonist called Chandri Lahiri. There are a couple of other ones where we will see by Shankar, and as we know, who was very sharp and had a couple of very popular cartoons about almost all the eminent people at the time, as well as almost all the important events. And the reason why I ended up using them is because they really seem to bring about the what was happening at these times, and it brings to the adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So when we talk about civilizational conviction and Tibet and how that changed. So in 1950, soon after independence, we see that India believes that it has civilizational ties both to China and Tibet, right? Excuse me. In 1950, we see Nehru writing in a letter that if relations between India and China suffer, all of Asia will be impacted. He's also very aware of the centuries-old civilizational, social, cultural relation with Tibet, and he's very certain that that needs to be kept alive as well. Now, when Chinese forces march into Tibet in 1950, India chooses to prioritize its relationship with China over Tibet, because one of the major reasons for that is the conviction that even if China manages to politically or territorially occupy Tibet, there is no way that they will be able to take over Tibet's identity. So in that context, to that extent, Tibet will continue to be autonomous. Now, however, we see a change coming about as we advance towards 1959. Now, in the early years, Nehru and others are of the belief that the civilizational connections between China and India are what are going to allow the two countries to build the Asian century, as it were. However, we see that recent experiences come to be more strongly influential in the path that these two states take, and not necessarily their civilizational connections. So what does that mean? In India's case, where Nehru and others believe that being a moral power in the Committee of Nations is the correct way to go forward. In case of China, we see that their recent experiences with force as the PRC was being created is what guides how they look at Tibet, how they look at India, and essentially how they look at how China begins to make its mark in the neighborhood and beyond that in the world. Now, this brings us to the territorial anxiety and Tibet. And even here, we see that in the 1950s, while there are some, most significantly Sardar Patel, who writes a letter to Nehru talking about the territorial threats that emanate from China towards India, Nehru and others are not that convinced of there actually being a territorial threat. And one of the reasons for that is, as I mentioned earlier, the entire question of how the Himalayas form a natural boundary or natural border. Nehru talks about how the terrain of Tibet right up to the Himalayas is not going to be conducive for the PLA to actually move into India. However, this also begins to change as the years go by. We know in 1956, India comes to know about the transgressions that are happening in Barahoti. In 1957-58, 57, in fact, we come to know about the road in Aksai Chin, which again is something that questions India's sense of territoriality. And by 1959, obviously, the territorial threat, which did not exist earlier, is very, very real. Now, when it comes to development, even there, we see that the relationship of trade and aid that existed between Tibet and India, in part as a result of the Simla Accord of 1914, is something that begins to change as the years go by. So in around 1950, we see Indian officials in Lhasa and elsewhere suggesting to Delhi that Tibet be given aid to help them with agriculture, because it will stabilize the government as well as it will add to the social improvement of Tibet. However, once the Chinese move in, they cut off the possibilities of India doing trade. Indian currency can no longer be used. There are people from Chinese banks who are going into all of these various towns and even smallest towns in Tibet and offering to provide money so that they don't really have to depend on Indian money. And that also, in this way, we see this change coming about between 1950 and 1959. So how do these things manifest? They eventually manifest in the way where we see in 1959 that when the Dalai Lama's people decide that it is time for him to take asylum, ask for political asylum in India, that decision has already been made a couple of days ago. What you see on your screens is a cable that was sent from Delhi to Lhasa on 15th March, 2 days before the Dalai Lama leaves Lhasa. And this essentially passes on the information that Delhi has taken a decision, the Prime Minister himself has taken a decision for the Dalai Lama to be given asylum in case he asks for it. Now, and that is largely a result of these particular aspects of images, I argue, that were where India did not see a threat in 1950, but by the time in 1959, there is a idea of threat coming from China. Now, where does this take us? Essentially, we can possibly look at use a framework of mediated images to look at other post-colonial states which have had similar beginnings, like in the case of India, where the various institutions have not essentially organically risen out of society, but have been introduced by colonial rulers. That's possibly one way of looking at it. Another is the mandala theory, where we hear about the enemy's enemy being the friend. Now, this seems to me like a relationship between states that is being mediated through other states. So possibly that's also another place where a framework like this could work. And as well as the other place that one could think of is international organizations. So maybe mediated images are not, mediated images do not necessarily have to be mediated through states, but also maybe international organizations. In the paper, I talk about how Krishna Menon uses the UN as a platform where he talks about India's values and how India looks at the world. So maybe if you look at the UN, or even more recently, if you look at India's efforts to become a part of the nuclear suppliers group as a question, as an issue of status, maybe these are some of the places where we can try and look through the framework of mediated images. That is my presentation. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you. So now, Bérénice, over to you for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. It's really exciting to be there for the first ESSAIR conference. I'm afraid I couldn't enjoy the first day, but I hope it went well. Certainly, this panel has been very interesting for me to hear and to read the three papers that were circulated, because I think it's really important to have this session right now, because we're really experiencing in some ways a turn right now in the history of South Asia's international relations, in the sense that we now have really a number of historians who are working on these questions, which didn't used to be the case. And this is a conversation that has been largely shaped by people in IR, in political science, etc. But now we're seeing a change in this, and that's partly because we have a growing access to archives. And that in turn, specifically for South Asia, but in the context of a broader historical turn in branches of IR at least, means that we're really, I think, at a really exciting moment to think about international relations in the subcontinent historically, and through historical methodologies or insights. So this is a very timely panel, and I think what all these papers really show is what this increasing access to archives, whether on Sino-Indian relations, on India-Pakistan, or on early modern South Asia, which is still underrepresented, can do for us. And it's timely for three reasons, I would say. One is that these questions are very much live, and there is very much a need for some empirical grounding in historical evidence and in over the longue durée. And I think it's really interesting that you chose that Tanja Buehrer was here today to think about what the Mughal period and the early colonial period might yield for us. It's also a moment where we're seeing history being used and manipulated and sometimes abused in South Asia. So they're very much discourses about history that are being deployed in today's politics. And so thinking through scholarly methods, through different disciplinary lenses, is very important. And finally, of course, the leaders that are at the helm in South Asia right now, and by leaders, I don't just mean people at the top of the states like Modi, but also foreign secretaries, etc., national security advisors, are themselves informed by these historical narratives and these questions. And so this is where we can have a direct impact as well, is by actually creating these narratives and thinking about the multiple ways in which these narratives have been deployed and affected other leaders, because the question of continuity and change is still as important as ever. So 3 papers then that I think all show in really complementary ways, I think this is what I like about this panel, what we can do when we start thinking historically and archivally. So I'll take the papers in the order I read them, if you don't mind. So I read Tanja Buehrer and then Deepal and then Ameya Pratap Singh's paper. So for Tanja, I hope you don't mind if I use first names, but for Tanja, thank you. This was really, really fascinating. As I just mentioned, I think you do something really important because we still tend to think that we've started bringing international relations back to the 1900s when it comes to South Asia, but we certainly have still very, very little idea of how the early modern period can play into these accounts. It seems to me in some ways that there's a challenge here because in some ways we're starting to think, and I think some of the papers that we saw today are thinking about ancient India and the way that its intellectual heritage of thinking about the international and India's place in the world can still shape India and South Asia more broadly today. But somehow the early modern and suddenly the Mughal period is very much absent. So there's a big gap between an attention to, I think, ancient India in some ways, albeit still relatively minor, and of very much our modernist or 20th century centric understanding of international relations. And your paper, I think, can fill a gap that's very important here. I thought what I took from this paper to start with is the idea of a very brief moment where you see roughly in the 70s, early 1780s, maybe up to the early 19th century, you see a brief moment of a real opening up and cross-cultural interaction that really finds bounds of diplomacy, both as a cultural practice and as a legal practice. It's very much a teeming world of diplomacy you're describing in these courts of the Nizam of Hyderabad with these North Indian, Parsi and Indian and British EIC intermediary. It was also very interesting to think about, and this is in a way quite a counterintuitive and I think quite valuable argument, that you're saying that something that helped the EIC intermediaries to fit into these systems that were culturally very different is precisely that they were not aristocrats, that they were not representing a king, that they didn't have diplomatic traditions of themselves, and therefore they could really amalgamate and implant themselves into this milieu and make something out of it. And so it's a reminder, I think, and I would certainly emphasize this point a bit more in your paper than you've done so far, that there's a sort of, as you say, compatibility of different political systems that was created through European and Asian diplomatic intermediaries in face-to-face encounters, not at the level of diplomatic letters, but really day-to-day courtly interactions. The other thing that I think I would emphasize in your paper, and I would like to know a bit more about how you conceive of this in terms of your broader argument, because I think this could be threaded through and pushed forward further in the article, is this idea that you're talking about the principle of meritocracy. That is not something that the EIC used to promote, and yet that it started learning in the process of these courtly day-to-day diplomatic encounters in a South Asian Mughal context. And so in doing that, you're actually saying that this principle of meritocracy that we take to be a hallmark of the European nation states' modern civil service, that was actually born in a cross-cultural South Asian context. And this is important, I would say, not just for your article, but since we're talking here about a conference on international relations, I wonder how this could help us think more broadly about the story we tell about the rise of the modern international system, which is still certainly in the way we teach it, and in the sort of still dominant narrative, although it's been very effectively challenged. It's still centered on Westphalia and a much earlier period than that which you described. And so I think I would certainly push this, and I would like to know more about what you make of this now. The final thing I would say is that's more from a historical perspective. There's such a rich theme right now of new diplomatic history, which you seem to fit in. From what I can see, this for the early modern period, this hasn't englobed South Asia too much. It's other cross-cultural contexts, European contexts, early modern contexts that have been emphasized. South Asia is still relatively under-examined. So what do you contribute to this? Because I think it's very rich from that perspective. moving on to Deepal, well, this is obviously a paper that's close to my heart, because I myself have worked a lot on Sino-Indian relations, and I think it's a very good example of the possibilities that the current opening that we're seeing in the archives on Sino-Indian relations offer, and how much more there is to be done. In some ways, this is a very well-worn topic, and yet, partly because for so long the archives just weren't there, we've been really hanging up, it's been hanging through a thread, and we're filling that thread, and I think this is what you can contribute. Reading your paper, I thought there was a sort of slight imbalance in the paper, in the sense that I thought it almost seemed like two papers rather than one. On the one hand, you had the discussion on the more IR-centric discussion on images and mediated images. And I think this idea of mediated images is something I'd like to hear more about from you. I'd like to know what sort of work it does. And if, in this case, I think you particularly mean Tibet, between China and India. And I think you're right. What does it do in comparison to other arguments that have been made, for example, by Dava Norbu, about the centrality of Tibet in Sino-Indian relations, or about, in my own work, the fact that this very much in the early 50s, just at the time that the first episode you mentioned, when China peacefully liberates Tibet, as it says, this was very much a triangular state-building competition. Tibet wasn't just a target of China and India. The Tibetan government itself was engaged in state-building and, to some extent, in territorial expansion. So the territorial anxiety that India felt at this time was just as much, but you're right, it was beyond that, it was about China, but it was immediately about Tibet's territorial expansion and the way it could offer China an entry point into India. So I'm just wondering where you situate yourself and what sort of theoretical work you're doing there. The other aspect of your work is more the historical aspect and the seam of archives that you're using, that I think for quite a few of them have still very much been left underexplored, at least. So here I want to know a bit more then about, since you're dealing with archives, you're dealing with history. And I was a bit surprised that you'll make almost no reference to historians' work in this. I mean, there's a couple of quotes, but you're mixing participants and contemporary accounts, which are interesting but should be treated as almost as primary sources, and historians' work, and most of them are quite dated, and because there's been new work since then. And you don't really engage with them. So I'm wondering, I think what needs to happen in this paper is really to realize its potential, you really need to make this theoretical argument, but you need to make it by addressing other, what we already know about Sino-Indian relations and the arguments that have been made about that period. For example, here I'm directly thinking, I'd like to know, about, I think the question of territorial anxiety is really interesting. And I think it's a bit more complex than you portray, maybe for the sake of theoretical elegance, but it was more complex in the sense that one reason, I mean, if anything, in the early 50s, India, and I think you'd agree with me, is strangely not worried about China, but that has historical elements for it. It's also because just before the invasion, you have a massive earthquake that reshapes the map of the eastern parts of India, what's now Arunachal, which is the part actually which is slightly easier to traverse from one perspective than in the northwest. And Indian authorities, for complex reasons, come out persuaded that the earthquake means that you will never be able to send an army through this. So this is just one example, but I think you need to probe further into the wider context for the way that Indian authorities make these calculations. That also means, so, the example I was giving you is an example rooted in underground politics, right? And in my work, I very much feel that these underground politics matter. So how do you fit that in? What's the connection between this and with these high politics level discussion that you're mentioning? Beyond that, globally, India is not just thinking about China in relation to Tibet, it's thinking of China globally in terms of China's interaction with the global order and its if we're talking about the PRC, it's integration into the global order. And this is a moment where India is very much invested. Suddenly, Nehru makes choices that maybe don't make sense today, but of saying we need to work with China. We need to make sure that we don't isolate it, we don't antagonize it. That means at the UN, for example, refusing to take up offers of a permanent seat on the UN Security Council if it means that China will be kept out of the UN. It also means fostering dialogue with China at other levels, including because of the links between the links and the perceived connections between China's decolonization endeavor and India's different decolonization endeavor. So all this, I think, really needs to be contextualized more to really bring out, you know, the specificity and what your argument brings to the table. Because I agree with you that this issue of perception really, really is key. But to do this, you need to replace it in its broader context and in the context of a much wider literature than I think you give credit to. And finally, on civilization, I think, again, it's quite complex because I think here people who are making these arguments about civilization are, it's not just Nehru, it's also people outside government. People like Ram Manohar Lohia, who actually talk very much about that whole, you know, who at some point says, well, the whole of Tibet is actually part of India and we should aim. I mean, it's sort of pre-Akan Bharat notion, right? Or sort of alternate, rather, I should say, should fall under India. So you do have, I think, a much more diverse argument about civilization than you present here. So I would end there, and as I say, yeah, push you more on the broader historiographical landscape and this issue of the image, which I think is very interesting. And finally, Ameya, thank you for this paper. I thought it was beautifully written, by the way. I very much enjoyed it. I think you're making a really important push together with other scholars that really needs to be made to say we need to think also about patterns of trust building, cooperation and dialogue. And you're right that this hasn't been looked at enough, notwithstanding Pallavi Raghavan's recent and much needed book. I thought that I really liked, and I thought it was quite persuasive, your SDS centric analysis of, and I think it's quite persuasive as a way to explain certain mechanisms for trust building. And I do think you managed to situate this historically quite persuasively in Nehru's own writing. So this was a wonderful look at Nehru's deconstruction of fear, I think. My question for you is, so you focus on fear, and I can see why you would do this. At the same time, thinking about the way that right now there's an interesting literature that's emerging in IR on, and among historians on emotions more broadly. How does fear relate to other emotions? Is it only fear that Nehru is conceptualizing? Is it, or does he see fear? You mentioned that it's relational. What are the other emotions that fit together with that? I know that for later, you know, Priya Chako, for example, speaks about Nehru inventing a politics of friendship. Can we bring these into dialogues? Can we also think about what about anger? You know, fear is something that it often expresses itself into anger, including between diplomats and leaders potentially, right? Diplomats are supposed to hide their emotions, and yet at the same time, they're seen as winning if they manage to play on the emotions of others. So I think fear is you know, deconstruction is really interesting, but can we again thread fear with other emotions and how it relates to them in Nehru thought and indeed beyond that? And that's my second point, which is that, so while I thought your exploration of Nehru was absolutely fascinating, in some ways it's also going against a recent grain in the historiography, which is to push back against the idea that it's all about Nehru. I mean, in a way, you can see why Nehru is, it's such a rich theme to mind. He is an incredibly elegant, committed, enthusiastic thinker, but he wasn't alone. And so I'm wondering, you know, who else is thinking about conceptualizing fear in India? And also, how does does his idea, how do his ideas about fear that you explore, how do they filter through? How does he manage to impress this on the people who will actually be tasked with dealing with the Pakistanis at that stage, before the actual signature, which happens between him and Liaquat, of course. So I think this would be quite important. And I would just end on a question for all of you, and thanking you once again for the intellectual oomph you gave to this. Because you all do international relations, this is about doing international relations in South Asia historically, but you all do so in very different ways. So I want to know a bit more about what it means to do international relations in South Asia and about South Asia historically for you. As I ask scholars for Deep and for Ameya, and as a historian, especially an early modern historian for Tanja. And finally, Tanja, because you were the first one I spoke to, but I think this question would make sense only after I've discussed the other papers. Taking the concepts of image that, for example, Deepal has mentioned, or theories of systemic change that IR has proposed, can that help you think about your paper as well? So in other words, can you inject some of IR's insights into this historical paper? I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Bérénice, for these comments. I'll suggest that the panelists respond very quickly to them, and then we'll start the Q&A session. Since we're running a bit late, I also suggest that we extend the Q&A session for 10 minutes, so until 5:40 instead of 5:30, 5:45, if it's okay with everyone. So please, the panelists, whoever wants to start with the comments, and then we'll gather questions.
Okay, as we're running out of time, I try to answer as quickly as possible. Thank you, Bérénice, for your comments and your questions. I think you made a really important point, emphasizing that early modern historians and modern historians are not communicating with each other. And particularly this period of transition in Germany, it is coined Sattelzeit, is highly neglected, which is really a shame, because I think this was a period of time when the global connectedness in terms of qualitative connectedness and mutual exchange was at its high times. Probably never ever a period appeared again when there was like such a mutual exchange of like concepts of governance and practices of diplomacy ever happened, and the circulation of ideas of governance and interaction from Europe to South Asia and back, or kind of towards the Atlantic and so on and forth. So this brings me to your point, kind of the rise of the modern international system. Explain it more, not only like a Eurocentric process, but something that emerged from interaction across the cultures and continents. I rather tried to do that through kind of explanations how the diplomatic service emerged or developed in cross-cultural interaction. For instance, the principle of meritocracy, but also exclusion of women from diplomatic interaction and so on and so forth, which partly was reflected European tendencies of the time, of European state building and professionalization of diplomatic service, but also was like a response to cross-cultural interactions. So yeah, this is rather my approach to explain the rise of the modern international system, not only through an Eurocentric perspectives, so rather like from bottom up, or like from servants or company servants and Mughal servants. Yeah, I think I have to keep it short. Regarding concepts of image, I have to think about it. I'm not ready to answer this, but kind of to apply to my case, I have to think about it. But it's thank you for the idea. Okay.
Thank you, Tanja. I mean, if there's something else you want to say, it's fine. I mean, we are late, but I'm sure everybody is also happy to listen to comments and to reply. So I don't want to stop you. So
It's fine.
Okay. So Deep or Ameya, whoever would like to reply.
I'm happy to go. If it's okay, I'm not going to switch on my video because my Wi-Fi seems to be acting up and I don't want to freeze out in the middle of the conversation and everything. So Bérénice, thank you. Those were very important and useful interventions. So one of the reasons for why it is possible that, you know, the theoretical part and the empirical part don't seem to go as well together, or there seems to be a disjunction between the two of them, might have to do with the fact that this is one of the chapters from my dissertation. So where obviously I have brought in my theoretical framework and taken the, you know, one of the empirical chapters, and maybe I'm guessing that shows. But since you were asking about how I look at the entire concept of mediation, I would possibly go back to you know, how in the Hegelian system the idea of mediation comes about, right? So how essentially the idea of objectification of the individual self, right? If there is something outside of you which belongs to you, right? You possess it, and therefore your identity is validated by that ownership. So in this case, I'm guessing what I'm trying to establish is how India is demanding the recognition by others of India's identity by acknowledging that the relationship that it has with Tibet is one that belongs to India. So that's how I would look at it. As far as situating situating the aspect of China with others. Others, yes, absolutely. That again, this is something that I kind of had to keep out because I was trying to make a shorter paper for submission. But yes, I mean, even while this entire Tibet thing is going on, there is also the Korean War aspect is going on. While, you know, India is in 1950 talking to China about Tibet, or talking to Tibet directly, there is also the aspect of India having a whole separate conversation to world powers, to the US, to UK, to the UN, about the Korean War and about China's role in it. So yes, it's part of a much bigger whole. I will possibly have to figure out how to bring all of those together. So yeah, I'm going to stop there, and maybe if we have time, come back to the rest.
Thank you. Ameya, I think it's your turn now.
Thank you, Professor, for your comments. It's all really helpful. The first question on incorporating the emotional turn in IR, that's either just me being lazy or trying to avoid the whole can of methodological questions. I did spend my first year thinking through how the emotions literature could be used, but there were questions surrounding whether Nehru is actually feeling fear, whether actors actually do feel fear, and how can that be accessed. And so there were a lot of methodological questions that I could avoid by treating fear as a concept that a lot of IR does anyway, as opposed to doing this. But it does seem like now that there are the methodological and theoretical tools to engage with that scholarship, perhaps I should bring that back in. The second question on it's all about Nehru. I do take your point. I think I need to be more careful about
bringing to light the sort of bargaining that's taking place. And I'm not sure if I put it in the paper, but it's in my larger chapter. I think I have the sort of discussions and debates taking place in the cabinet at the time before the Nehru-Liaquat agreement between Sardar Patel, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, who are vehemently against this and who distrust Pakistan entirely. And Patel says, for instance, that regardless of whatever agreement you sign, they're just not going to follow it. So what's the point? And even a year after the agreement is signed, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee is constantly talking about war, India taking over territory. So perhaps I need to bring that to the fore more noticeably. Yeah. The third question, how to do history and IR, I have no immediate answers. But yeah, thank you so much for your comments.
Well, thank you very much for, again, these fascinating papers. Thank you, Bérénice, for this very interesting discussion as well. It's really a privilege to have you all here. And I mean, going late into the evening for people from Delhi. So thank you very much. We'll now open the Q&A session. I think Christian had a question.
Yes, thank you much for the wonderful presentations. Very inspiring and interesting. I have a short question for Deep. I'm a little bit confused. Bérénice has also made the point. When you look at this, when you look on Tibet as the mediated image between India and China, it somehow seems to contrast, let's say, how should I say, the non-mediated image between India and China on the bilateral level, on the international arena. I mean, the 50s were the honeymoon of India, or it's normally regarded to be the honeymoon period of India-China relations. You have the Bandung Conference, you have Panchsheel, you have the Himlichini Bye-Bye. So I'm somehow confused how you bring this in, or in how far does what role does the mediated image on Tibet play in the overall image between India and China during this period? Thank you.
Maybe you can start answering that question and we'll take the other questions afterwards.
Okay, yeah. So Christian, thank you for that question. So essentially, what I try to suggest is that, yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, the 50s start with this entire idea of, as I said, India and China being the two engines that would take Asia forward, and so on and so forth. But as time passes, and this is something that we see very significantly happening around, I think, 1956, which is when India comes to no transgressions in Barahoti. Late 1956 is when the Dalai Lama comes to India and talks about how he does not want to go back because China is not living up to the 17-point agreement from 1951 and things like that. And that is when I think the wheel begins to turn. So to my mind, there is this very distinct phase where the relationship begins to turn from around, I think, 1956, 57, because in 57, Nehru sends the Dalai Lama back, asks him to go back and says that his stay in Tibet is absolutely important. And in less than 2 years later, when the Dalai Lama is about to leave Tibet, there is that turn that comes about. Does that answer your question?
Just a short follow-up. You mentioned in your presentation that China was an obstacle to India's self-image. I've not got the point. Why?
Right. So I think what I mean by that is, so these various aspects of self-image that India is putting forward, whether it's its idea of how it is civilizationally connected to various other actors, or what it considers to be its territory, and as I mentioned that as it gives out these ideas about itself and how it sees itself, through the various other actors, it also looks at how they are being interpreted and how those that are interpreting it are reflecting it back. And I think that is where India begins to see how China is disregarding the aspects of self-image that India is giving out. So for example, on territoriality, right, where India has a particular idea about what its idea of territoriality is, it sees China disregarding that, not in the beginning, but from going on. Can I quickly respond to something, since we have a little bit of time, something that Bérénice had raised earlier about it not being just Nehru. You mentioned Ram Manohar Lohia, which is absolutely right. In fact, when I did not expand into this during the presentation, but when I talk about how I arrive at the aspects of self-images, there are a whole host of other players who exist, who bring them about, right? And in fact, if you go back, you can look at Tagore and Tagore's idea of nationalism there. Gandhi, of course, is a very big player. In fact, Nehru again talks about how many of these ideas came to him from the conversations that he has had with various others, and he talks about it, I think, in the introduction to Discovery of India, or if I'm not mistaken. So yes, there are a number of other personalities who help in the coalescing of these particular aspects. And as I said, there are definitely way more than the ones that I talk about, but I work with these three.
Thank you very much. So I had two questions, one for Ameya and one for Tanja. And if no one else had questions, then after that we'll wrap up to start the session, the brainstorming session on ESSAIR. So Tanja, first, I was intrigued about your tiny line about women. So admittedly, women were excluded from diplomatic practices officially, it seems, but then you also mentioned that favorite women of powerful men were important political agents in local faction and regional alliance building. And I was wondering to what extent you think there might be a possibility to include your period into the larger, I guess, reemergence of the history of women in different fields and in the field of foreign policy in that case. So that was the first question. And for Ameya, I find it fascinating how new political possibilities are opened up by alternative conceptions of politics. And your paper showed that very well, and I found that extremely interesting. I was wondering, what was Pakistan's place in that study, in the sense that, you focus on Nehru, but the relation between the two countries also depend on the other actor. To what extent do you think that Pakistan's conceptions of politics at that time was also amenable to more agreement with India? Thank you very much.
Yeah, this is one point which is really interesting, women as compared in the early modern European context to women as diplomatic agents in the South Asian context was quite similar. There were important diplomatic actors in terms of marriage alliances, but also kind of influence political rulers and the less visible, but also nevertheless very important diplomatic actors to connect and build alliances. And somehow the exclusion of Indian noble women from as diplomatic actors between the company and Indian rulers somehow reflected the European trend connected to modern state building, professionalization of service. There was kind of an exclusion of women from politics as well in Europe, particularly after the French Revolution. But on the other hand, it was not a simple reflection of this European tendency. It was actually implemented much faster or more strict in South Asia than in Europe. In Europe, it took until the end of the 19th century until this process was completed. And in South Asia, it was already completed end of 18th century because it was part of imperial politics to exclude Indian noble families from familial ties, which would have meant social and financial obligations. So this kind of modernization process was implemented faster in South Asia than in Europe. It did not simply reflect it. This is another part of this like interconnected histories, or that might have had an influence on implementation of exclusion of women in Europe as well. So yeah.
Very interesting. Thanks. I mean, I think that's a branch of history that will also develop further. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Ameya, if you'd like to.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your question. I did try to reflect a little bit on what was Pakistan thinking and what the strategic elite in Pakistan was thinking when this crisis was going on. It's a little difficult because the archival resources are not equally available. But from historical sources in the Ameya itself, there was this complicated negotiation surrounding the No War Declaration, which again, Pallavi Raghavan has covered in her book, that are going on at the time. So there is evidence to show that even though they couldn't agree on the terms for the No War Declaration, that there is this underlying logic of conciliatory signaling at the time that's growing in that relationship. And I've tried to look at public speeches by Liaquat Ali Khan at the time. And as the crisis escalates, he's trying to demonstrate resolution, that if war comes, we're prepared, India will get an equal reply. And then just as the negotiations are about to begin, he takes a sort of more decidedly conciliatory tone. The other avenue to access Pakistani thinking on this is the way Nehru describes what Liaquat's doing during the conference. So one of the big concerns that the Indians have at the time is whether Pakistan as an Islamic country can actually guarantee the rights of religious minorities. And this again is one of those questions where Patel and Shyama Prasad Mukherjee believe that there's no way this can happen. But Nehru writes this letter to B.C. Roy, where he goes into this deep dive into Arabs and Muslim history and how it was always tolerant, and why he believes Liaquat's reassurances in the conference. Liaquat openly discusses the pressure being put on him by right-wing factions in Pakistan, and therefore that this is about managing audience costs rather than his view on the constitutional nature of the state. Yes, there is all this on the other side that perhaps I need to explore in greater detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.